romantic love is an invention. It started off as a literary invention. It was then popularized via various forms of media, such as film and TV. And this popularization and glamorization has gone so far that we kind of think it's something holy and glorious to be pursued in life. But you know what? Fundamentally, it's fake. It's a propaganda, an invention that people have just come to believe in. So what I want to discuss in this video is the notion of literary romance. It has been plaguing our collective consciousness for centuries, and it's created so much ridiculous and unnecessary and, realistically speaking, unachievable ideals that we try to strive for in our lives. So personally, I don't believe in this sort of love. What I mean by this is, I don't think it's a form of a natural emotion that we can harbor. We have to have acquired it or learned it from somewhere. So whether it's media, film, books, or just other people telling us about it. And this sort of emotion is contrasted to feelings that we can just naturally feel as a human, such as, sadness and anger and just some sort of attachment or sexual drive towards other people. So what I want to discuss in this video is how this myth of love was originally invented. What form does it take, and why people continue to take it as a real-life possibility, and the consequences of our continued belief in it as a real-life possibility. So for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to clarify, throughout this video I may be referring to it interchangeably as love or romantic love or literary romance. Of course, I know that there are various kinds of love besides romantic love and besides that specific literary form of romance, but sometimes when I use the word love, I will just be using it to refer to the literary romance. Please don't have the misconception that sometimes I'm just talking about love in general as fake, which that's not what I'm trying to say. And I call it the literary romance because it originated in literature. Of course, it's taking many other forms now. And I also do acknowledge that not all forms of romantic love kind of fall into the category of the literary romance. And I'm not going to kind of count different sorts of romantic love because it's so idiosyncratic, depends on the person and your culture and stuff. But yeah, I'm just going to acknowledge that there are various kinds of romantic love, but what I'm focusing on is this very typical form of literary romance. Some of you may have heard of this famous story called Tristan and Iseult. It was a chivalric romance that became very popular during the 12th century, and it actually had many variations told by different poets in the 12th century, and its origin was speculated to have been from a Celtic myth. In very oversimplified terms, it was basically this woman named Iseult who had a long-time affair with this knight called Tristan, while she was married to another man who's like much more powerful than Tristan. So they endure various periods of separation and obstacles throughout their relationship. There was also a bit of like a magical love potion element in it. You can think about it in terms of like the love potion in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Although one important caveat is that whether this love potion was present differed according to each version, and this is a significant point that I will come back later. So the reason why I'm mentioning this myth is because it's kind of considered like the prototype of the literary romance, and this was extensively discussed in this book by Denise de Rougemont called Love in the Western World, and a lot of what I will go on to discuss will be sourced from this book. Rougemont thinks that Tristan and Iseult offers the prototype of what we now conceive of as love, and here's how he describes this model. It is not too much to say that they never miss a chance of getting parted. When there is no obstruction, they invent one, as in the case of the drawn sword and of Tristan's marriage. They invent obstructions as if on purpose, notwithstanding that such barriers are their bane. Can it be in order to please author and reader? It is all one, for the demon of courtly love which prompts the lovers in their innermost selves to the devices that are the cause of their pain is the very demon of the novel as we in the West like it to be. What then is the legend really about? The parting of lovers? Yes, but in the name of passion and for love of the very love that agitates them, in order that this love may be intensified and transfigured at the cost of their happiness and even of their lives. Tristan and Iseult do not love one another. They say they don't, and everything goes to prove it. What they love is love and being in love. They behave as if aware that whatever obstructs love must ensure and consolidate it in the heart of each and intensify it infinitely in the moment they reach the absolute obstacle, which is death. Tristan loves the awareness that he is loving far more than he loves Isolde the Fair, and Isolde does nothing to hold Tristan. All she needs is her passionate dream. So the crux of what they pursue is not some sort of relationship with each other, but rather what we pursue is what promises to uplift and excite us, so that in spite of ourselves we shall be transported into the real life spoken of by poets. But this real life is an impossible one. What is heralded by the sky with high-riding clouds and by the empurpled heroic sunset is not day, it is night. Real life is elsewhere, Rimbaud said. Real life, indeed, is but another name for death. Where did this idea of this uplifting, exciting other reality which they think is real life, where did this idea come from? If we go back to Plato, as early as his works, Phaedrus and Symposium, he does mention some sort of frenzy or delirium, which is neither conceived nor born in a man's soul except by the inspiration of heaven. It is alien to us, its spell is wrought from without, it is a transport and infinite rapture away from reason and natural sense. It is therefore to be called enthusiasm, a word which naturally means possessed by God. And now we move forwards in history from the ancient Greeks, and we come to the time where we have Celtic myths, and there was this god called the Eros, who is often interpreted as inhabiting, taking physical form in women. And what the effect of this myth was that when man, most myths and, all those things were written by men and from the male's perspective. So when man sexually desires a woman, it seems like he's desiring something divine, godly, because, the god Eros is in the woman. And it raises pure sexual desire, which is really an animalistic drive, to the status of some sort of divine, otherworldly pursuit. And it seems like you're pursuing some higher form, some eternal joy. Furthermore, the idea of romantic love has also been associated with mysticism. The lover is alone with all that he loves. Passion is by no means the fuller life which it seems to be in the dreams of adolescence, but is on the contrary a kind of naked and denuding intensity, verily a bitter destitution, the impoverishment of a mind being emptied of all diversity, an obsession of the imagination by a single image. In the face of the assertion of its power, the world dissolves, the others cease to be present, and there are no longer either neighbours or duties or binding ties or earth or sky. One is alone with all that one loves. We have lost the world and the world us. So why has the idea of such love flourished? Well, I think there's a twofold reason. One is a more religious one, another is a practical one. In the 12th century, around the time when that myth of Tristan and Isolde was very popular, Christianity pretty much dominated all aspects of life. Not only people's spiritual lives, but effectively also regulated how people practically conducted themselves every day in society. So belief in mysticism, the Celtic myths, and anything else that's considered paganism by Christianity, it's essentially a form of rebellion. It's a rebellion against the teachings of Christianity on a spiritual level. Further, this belief in pursuit of passionate love can also be a rebellion on the societal and pragmatic level against the dictates of how life should be conducted under Christian teachings. Because, if you haven't noticed, the majority of love stories, especially the earlier ones, take form outside of marriage. Marriage is something considered sacred and regulated by Christianity, and if they want to rebel against the structure of Christianity, they gotta love someone outside of marriage. So as I have discussed, this romantic myth actually has very strong spiritual roots. And I think this root is very much reflected in the fact that when people think about love, they think about it in the sense of something like magic. People tend to have this image of falling in love being akin to two people being cast under a spell, and then typical, you see each other and you're like, oh my gosh, the heaven and earth opened for me, and this is the moment of my life when I come to the realization that I'm destined to be with this person. It's like this person has some sort of unactivated spell on them upon birth, and then the spell becomes activated once they meet the right one, and then everything just flows magically and happily ever after from that point onwards, because they're destined to be together. And also they tend to be infatuated with the other person to an extent that this infatuation just overwhelms and subsumes all other interests this person has in life and all other worldly duties. And the reason why we tend to conceive of love like that is only because, it began as a spiritual phenomenon. That is how spiritual phenomenons are. And what people have done is basically they clothed it in this facade called romantic love, but you know what they're experiencing is really like what very spiritual people experience. So remember how I mentioned before that some versions of the Tristan myth contained a love potion? In these versions, it was literally magic that made those people fall in love with each other. And what I think is that the magic element in like more contemporary love stories that's just being transformed into this thing called irresistible passion. It's like when you see that person, you could barely walk and you can't do anything but want to be with that person and try to like work towards that goal. When people really come to sincerely believe in love as something magical, like a passionate ecstasy, this lifting of you above all worldly concerns, people kind of start to believe that it's something that really happens in real life, that we're really inclined to just harbor this sort of feelings towards like a selected person. And you know why people like come to believe this? The adoption of certain linguistic conventions naturally involve and fosters the rise of the latent feelings most apt to be expressed in this way. That is the sense in which it may be said, following the Foucault, that a few people would fall in love had they never heard of love. So fundamentally, the argument is that love is a learned feeling. There's honestly nothing very unique or problematic about calling something a learned feeling because we have an abundance of those things in our culture. Certain cultures have words for some feelings, and these words don't exist in other cultures, and it seems like people in cultures without those words just don't really feel that sort of thing. It may be true that people sometimes feel things that, you know, is very similar to what this other term in another culture expresses, but without that terminology, they won't really be able to like recognize this feeling concretely, and they won't really be able to like coherently understand what they're feeling. So love is a learned feeling in the sense that you honestly do not feel like that towards anyone by instinct if you have not been taught that is what love ought to feel like, and you're kind of like expecting it to feel like that. In a sense, you are creating a narrative for yourself. You are telling yourself that you feel this way. So what happens is that you are essentially taking bits and pieces of what you intuitively feel for this other person and transforming these bits and pieces of trivial feelings into this bigger package called love. And this bigger package is like what you've been educated to believe in. It's like you have this overall structure and you're trying to fit in little bits and pieces of what you experience in real life regarding this person into the bigger structure, and like creating this narrative of falling in love for yourself. Well, another interesting question to be asked is that why must the typical literary romance be fraught with obstacles and heartbreaks? So the thing is, love started as a form of escapism. So escapism into the sort of otherworldly realm. So if there are no obstacles, then it can't be something outside of ordinary life which we strive towards as an ideal. If we can easily attain it, this relationship is just going to be part of life. If the relationship is socially accepted or even celebrated, then it can't be a rebellion against society. And this is why most love appear in the form of extramarital affairs. More often than not, these stories end in tragedy because these forms of love are just not meant to be attainable and sustainable in ordinary society. So since the 19th century, happy endings in those love stories have been steadily on the rise. What changed? Personally, I think it's associated with the rise of individualism and the maturing of the romantic myth. So individualism places the well-being and the desires of the individuals at its core. The maturing of the romantic myths makes people gradually forget its spiritual roots. So people kind of cease to be aware of the very nature of this sort of love as like an otherworldly escape. When people think that individual wishes need to be accommodated in society, and that love is a real object worthy of practical pursuit, they start to write stories where individuals attain love in a socially accepted form, such as consummating it via marriage. However, you know, it's just rather interesting and like a very widely acknowledged point that most love stories do not continue beyond marriage, because I think people kind of have an awareness that it's impossible to keep depicting people's lives in terms of having this sort of love infatuation after they get married, because, you know, getting married, you kind of go back to the mundanity of everyday life. One problem with applying this sort of myth into the realm of everyday life is that we are driven to feel the depravity of real life ever more acutely. Moderns, men and women of passion, expect irresistible love to produce some revelation either regarding themselves or about life at large. Passion is everywhere treated as an experience, something that will alter my life and enrich it with the unexpected, with thrilling chances and with enjoyment ever more violent and gratifying. So many people start to worship passion to the extent that they believe their lives to be incomplete without it. However, the idealization of passion as something that we need to complete our self-understanding and live life to the full, in fact, contains some sort of internal paradox. We believe that it is the illusion of freedom and of living to the full, but really a man becomes free only when he has attained self-mastery, whereas a man of passion seeks instead to be defeated, to lose all self-control, to be beside himself and in ecstasy. I would really recommend a film that I personally love by Japanese director Hamaguchi Ryusuke. Its English translation is called Asako 1 and 2. I think it exemplifies the typical literary romance so well. It has a lot of elements of mysticism, escape, self-destructive outbursts of passion, all of which renders Asako's ideal relationship incompatible with the demands of everyday life. Moreover, the film does a mockery to this idea, for Asako is depicted as pursuing this sort of love as if it's a dream, and at the end of the movie she ultimately makes a decision to return to real life and wake up from the dream, and she chooses reality with its mundanity and imperfection. And it's kind of the idea that so long as she remains fixated on reliving this ideal of passionate love that she experienced as a young girl, she can never truly live in the real world. So as I've mentioned, one consequence of buying into this myth of love is our tendency of seeing our lives as depraved and incomplete if we do not experience it. When in reality there's nothing to feel depraved about, because this sort of love is just fake. It's not something that's meant to be naturally and essentially experienced as, a lot of things that people will naturally and inevitably experience just by living as a human in society. And I think even if you do perpetually experience it, a large part of the experience would be founded upon your own fabrication. So it's like you're trying to inflate the reality of your relationship with a certain person with some sort of transcendence or faithfulness. And also, a second damaging consequence arises when people believe so deeply in this myth that they try to import it into real life in the form of marriage. And that's just not a very smart decision. Because after they marry, they scream in despair about how marriage kills romance and marriage is the grave of love and etc. The thing is, there's nothing to be hurt and disappointed about, because this sort of love is not meant to be reconcilable with marriage. So it's really no coincidence that literary romance started as extramarital affairs. Its very form is contrary to the institution of marriage, for it feeds on obstacles and the constant unfulfillment of desires. It's quite absurd to accommodate these sort of feelings into the marriage institution. Romance feeds on obstacles, short excitations, and partings. Marriage, on the contrary, is made up of want, daily propinquity, growing accustomed to one another. Romance calls for the faraway love of the troubadours, marriage for love of one's neighbour. Where then a couple have married in obedience to a romance, it is natural that the first time a conflict of temperament or of taste becomes manifest, the parties should ask themselves, why did I marry? So I think this picture summarizes the difference quite well. To be in love is not necessarily to love. To be in love is a state, to love an act. A state is suffered or undergone, but an act has to be decided upon. Now, the promise which marriage means cannot fairly be made to apply to the future of a state which I am at the moment, but it can and should mortgage the future of conscious acts which I take on, to love, to remain faithful, to bring up my children. To maintain a marriage requires a personal exertion of effort, and that is due to a feeling of commitment. It's really something that's sourced from one's will, but to fall in love is an abandonment of the will, the willingness to be led by unknown forces. And this is why, upon the fading of that magical feeling called love, people start to come to the shocking realization that they need some effort and exertion of their will in order to maintain their marriage. Thank you for watching this video. This is all I have to say on this topic. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you liked this video. And again, I would love to read any of your comments on what you think about this topic.